Good morning from Virginia Beach, Virginia, and we're here for our third week of Docker Q&A. So just to remind you of the format, this is around an hour of me just blazing through a bunch of questions that you're asking in YouTube chat. And if you're someone who's in the Slack chat for the Docker Mastery courses, know that I'm going to kind of ignore Slack for a while, and we're going to focus on the YouTube chat because there's just way too much stuff going on in there. It's hard to keep track of both. So if you have questions, throw them in the chat. I'm going to go through all of them. I have to remember to change it from top chat to live chat. So that way I see all the questions. And this is still me figuring out how to do this stuff. So be nice, figure out if I have issues, please let me know in the chat. Like if my voice is messed up, if the video is disconnected, which has happened. Last week we actually lost connection a couple times. Maybe my internet or Wi-Fi was having problems. So if it terminates really quick during the hour, just realize that it's probably a technical problem on my side, and I will get it fixed as soon as possible. I get a nice little red bar that tells me if everything's good or not. And of course, if you're here from one of my courses, you know about everything I do on Udemy. If you are new or just jumping on this channel, I actually sell some Docker training a little bit online, and you can get that stuff at dockermastery.com and swarmmastery.com. And I'm just going to put those in the chat, and that way we'll have that as a reference. And then I will try to put in a bunch of reference links, but realize that the chat on this, if you just hang out afterwards, I will continue to ask questions in text a little bit, and or at least try to, and then post any links that I didn't get to, because we don't really have a show notes for this show. So I'm going to throw those in the chat either as we're going or later on afterwards, and away we go. So we're going to start at the top with Alex. He says, I run a small operation. There's no reason resource-wise to have more than one host. Do I need to still implement a swarm for production? Excellent question, Alex. And sometimes I will be referring to my AMA, my Ask Me Anything on GitHub. And let me go show you where I have that here. AMA. And I'm going to switch to... Real quick, I'm going to switch to screen view so we can actually see what I'm showing you. Magic. Okay, so here on GitHub in my AMA repo, so that's github.com/brettfisher.com/AMA. I answer random DevOps and Docker questions on the internet, and one of those is about Swarm in production. Let's see if I can find it. Yes. Okay, so this is question 8. I'm going to throw this into chat. So on question 8, someone asked about only one host in production. It's a great question. I would have said a few years ago, just do Docker in production, just run Docker. But Swarm is so great on one host, and you get more features out of the box. So absolutely, I would do one host on Swarm in production. You get way more out of the box with Swarm. You get health checks. You get secure encrypted secrets if you want to use those. You can use configs if you want to use those. You can easily spin up more than one replica. So even if you just have one host and you don't need the high availability of 2 hosts, you can still have multiple replicas of your web app or your HTML site or whatever. And those can be on the same host. And then as you replace them or update your services, you can make sure that they stay up. So it won't be hardware fault tolerant, but at least it'll be application fault tolerant in a little way, where if I need to do rolling updates, Swarm on that one node will give me that ability, whereas it would be hard for me to do that manually without Swarm, right? And that's a really great use for Swarm, I think, because it doesn't require any extra installation or tools. And bonus, you're learning the processes of an orchestrator. You're learning how to do rolling updates. You're learning about YAML files and stack files. So when you decide, or if you ever have to go to 2 hosts, then you have it already set up. You can just simply add a second host, and you're now in a duplicate model. Now remember, of course, with Swarm, we need 3 hosts minimum to have full redundancy. That's a little disclaimer. But I think 1 host is great. I do it. I recommend it to others, and it's great. Thanks, Alex. All right, next question. Nitesh, hi. When I pass a seccomp JSON file, security option, seccomp profile JSON, how does it flow? Client, daemon, runc, and then it gets finally applied to the host kernel or container. We're going crazy advanced right off the gate. Okay, so so for those that don't know, Docker has advanced security features that are enabled by default and have reasonable defaults, and then you can apply custom settings for those. Seccomp is one of them. Kernel features is another. There's AppArmor. There's SE Linux. There's several. Well, let's say that was 4. At least 4 different types of security lockdown settings that you can do on a container. And what's cool about Docker is that if you're not into super advanced stuff, you don't have to do that, because the defaults out of the box are really great. Actually, they're tested. The Docker team, actually Jesse Frizzell and the original sort of makers of the Docker engine 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, they added these features in so that if you just do default Docker, you get a lot of this out of the box, and it's meant to work with a broad range of stuff. So what Nitesh is asking about, or Nitesh, sorry if I mispronounced your name, he's asking about if I add a custom security comp profile, how exactly does that work? How does Docker use that JSON file, and how does it flow from client to daemon? So definitely it flows. So everything you do at the Docker command line is technically a client to daemon approach, right? Because the Docker command line uses an API to talk to the engine. That's why we can have a local Docker command line, and we can talk to any server that we have a secure connection to, right? And setting that up is a little more advanced. We won't get into that today. But once you have that set up, then yes, it's client to daemon, and then the Docker daemon is communicating that. Now, whether it's runc or it's containerd, because these are the internals of Docker, runc or containerd that apply those to the kernel modules in the kernel itself, I don't really know. I don't know which of them has the function internally to communicate that stuff. But it's definitely scoped to that container, so it would have to be either in runc or in containerd. Both of those are basically binaries that are used to manage a container's lifecycle. So every time you use Docker to spin up a container, you're running these little things in the background. So that's a great question. If you find an answer, if anyone else finds an answer or knows the answer, throw that in the chat. I don't know off the top of my head which function, a part of the API that actually communicates that. But it does end and begin with the container, and it is using native kernel functionality on your host. For instance, if you have a host that does AppArmor, which is a lot of them by default, then you can throw in custom AppArmor profiles, and it will use that feature set of the kernel. Brian Christener, hello. That's another Docker captain on the chat, and we always get 2 or 3 Docker captains on the chat, which is super awesome because that whole group of people are good people, and we see each other once or twice a year. It's a lot of fun. Hello to Kylix and Rodrigo, and I guess from Martin, I guess morning is good morning. Where you're at, where I'm at, it is definitely still morning, not quite noon. And let's see who we have. Alex, to what extent do I need to worry about Docker's resource consumption, especially where I'm limited? Example, server already running, low on resources, Raspberry Pi. Docker, okay, so I'm assuming, Alex, you're talking about the Docker engine using resources itself, not the applications running in Docker. Because Docker, all Docker's really doing is spinning up your applications in the background, however you decide to spin them up, and they're going to behave normally. They're going to behave like they would normally behave, unless you set resource limits up or resource reservations up for that application. So Docker is really just managing that process. It's not adding resources to that process per se. Now, of course, Docker itself is an engine binary, and it's running these other little tiny things like runc and containerd that we've mentioned in the background. So those themselves are spun up. I think Docker, when Docker has their enterprise edition, and they talk about very large servers where you're running dozens of containers on a single host, Docker talks about having 1 to 2 gig of RAM available. I don't know in a single Docker engine if really CPU resources need to be dedicated for Docker, because it's doing very, very little unless there's a problem. And if it's in a swarm, your swarm master, or your swarm managers rather, the ones that have that database, they are replicating the database, so they should be sort of dedicated to that purpose in a larger solution. If you're just running a couple of containers, if you're just running a MySQL server and web front end, to me, it's not an issue. I'd maybe have a couple of 100 meg just free on top of my expected resource utilization. But that gets into a larger question around your apps and what they're doing. Usually, the mistakes I see people making are going to production with applications in Docker, all running on the same server, and not limiting the resources of each of those apps, right? Because if you're running a database and you're running a web server, that database is going to take up all the resource, especially the RAM. It's going to take up all the memory on that server. It's designed to do that. So you have to learn how to set the limits on your Docker run commands so that you don't have the resources exhausted by one container and that the other container can't get any. And this is what we've been doing for decades now in virtual machines. So if you've created virtual machines, you know you set memory, you set CPU. If you pick one in the cloud, you're limiting CPU memory and all that. The same thing has to happen in containers, really. You don't have to. You can just do a Docker run, and it'll just do whatever. But if you're going to try to run multiple applications in a production setting where you really care about resource starvation and protecting things from getting starved, you have to set limits. So I would worry more about that than I would about Docker, the engine. Otherwise, if you're looking for production guidance in very large swarms or very large-scale Docker stuff, go to success.docker.com. That's success.docker.com. That is sort of their, well, it says it, their enterprise customer portal. And I would look in there about sort of resource limits, maybe something like that. And you'll basically, this is like Microsoft's knowledge base. You know how everybody has a KB solution? This is Docker's, right? It's different than the documentation, where the documentation side is more about prescriptive help and tutorials and maybe just feature documentation, whereas the Success Center is more about knowledge-based articles around advice, right? Maybe it's advice on how to get around a bug or a known limitation, or it's advice on setting up different platforms. There's lots of guidance around here about how to set up architecture in AWS and how to set up minimum and maximum resources and stuff like that. Ports you need to open, all that kind of stuff is in there. So check that out. Tons of stuff to look at. Great question. All right, moving on. We have Marvin, hello. Colonel Panic, hello. From Argentina, thank you. Hello, I want to visit you. That's a cool place, I hear. I have some friends that are close by it, some other Docker captains. All right, so we have a question from, I will just call you Vine. I'm sorry, that's a name I will definitely mess up. So Vine, we run a container. We define memory using -m. So when I allocate 2 gigs of memory to container, will the 2 gig of my machine memory only be used for the container? Yes. So the way that works is Docker is telling the kernel, the Linux kernel, that for this binary that's about to launch, limit its usage, okay? And there's a little bit of a gotcha there because Docker is going to tell the kernel to do that, but the application may not realize that it's been limited to that 2 gig. Great example is everything other than the newest, latest versions of Java. So if you're a Java developer, you know about all the options you have to set in your Java environment variables for setting up resource limitations, especially on memory. So Java has the habit of looking at the system memory, not the C group memory that it's been set at, and just deciding that it's going to use all, I think it has availability for all that system memory. Well, it doesn't if you're using a -m to set memory in a Docker run. So a good example is Java may go and try to use more RAM than it thinks, and then it'll hit basically out of memory errors, and the Linux subsystem will shut down or do various things to prevent that from happening. So yes, it's definitely a hard limit. There are also limits on CPU and I/O, so you can go check those settings out. And I think that's pretty much the answer to your question. All right, moving on. In continuation of my previous question, is there any way to see the applied seccomp profile from within the container, not by the way of writing a program which calls a blocked syscall? You are going deep, my friend. Okay, so I don't know if you could technically write a program to see that inside the container. I know, so Docker does not provide the functionality, like it doesn't provide you environment variables or some JSON or inspect command inside the container, right? You're gonna have to do that from outside the container. So maybe what you would do is you would set up a, if you needed to know the seccomp profile from inside, or maybe you just need to know which seccomp profile, you would have to set up something where you would set an environment variable that goes along with whatever you're doing in seccomp, so that you could, maybe if you were doing your own personal seccomp profile, you know, Nginx version 2, right? You would just make up your own names of your JSON files and maybe set an environment variable of that, so that when you're reading it from the environment variables inside your app, you can at least go, oh yeah, this is the one that we set. I know that's not really an efficient way to do it, but that's true of a lot of the settings that Docker sets. If you need that level of introspection from inside the container without giving the container extra privileges to go do that, which you don't usually want to do, especially if you're setting seccomp, right? You're probably trying to restrict your app. You're going to have to come up with some setting, or maybe have your own config file that you use swarm configs and throw in a config JSON as a bind mount maybe in there. But I don't think that there's a way to do that. Now, if you write something that is able to go do some syscalls on the Linux kernel, I have never written a program that does direct syscalls, so I'm not going to be able to answer that for you. I work more at an operations higher level, because I'm a pretend developer, in case you didn't know that. I talk about that in my courses. I develop, but not for a living. All right. 3 messages from Rodrigo. Okay. I have a question regarding support. Docker sells a support plan for EE Basic. Okay, I saw this question in the Docker Q&A, and I answered it there. My answer to you is, like, I don't know. I'm not a Docker partner, so I don't have access to get partner pricing. I can't verify that for you. You're going to simply have to reach out to Docker Sales, and there should be an email address or contact information on the Docker website for getting more information about the sales. If you go to try to buy a subscription, there's probably a contact email there to find out if that's true. Basically, he was asking about pricing of buying from Docker directly or buying from a reseller of Docker in Brazil. Yeah. So sorry, I don't know the answers to that. I don't know what partners are actually limited to versus Docker directly, because I've never had to buy subscriptions. As part of the Docker Captains program, we get a few free licenses. So my little lab that I get to play with, I don't have to buy it. And then for my clients, they kind of buy it directly. They don't buy it through me. I don't really get into software resales because there's not a lot of money in that world. So unless you sell a lot of software, so I don't. So good question. Sorry, I don't have a better answer. Okay, CJ, hello. Okay, we're back to previous questions in memory. If I allocate 2 gig out of 8 remaining 6 gigs, when my host machine needs more than the 6 gig of RAM, will it use the free memory left by the container? Okay. No. Sorry. Yes, it will use the free memory. When you limit a container, right? When you use that -m, that's limiting the container. That's not reserving memory for the container. Okay. There is no, and I'm going to make sure that I'm correct about this. There is no setting in Docker Run Um, Yeah, so there is no setting in Docker to reserve memory for a container that prevents anything else on the host from using that memory. It's more about preventing the application in the container from using more resources than it should. Now, if you're using Swarm, you can use, if you've ever done a Docker service create, there are options for reserving, and I talk about in my Swarm course, Swarm Mastery. In Swarm Mastery, the way that Swarm reserves that memory isn't at the kernel level of the OS where it limits other applications from using it. It uses it at more of an at a scheduling level to decide which host could potentially get that container. So if you think about all your services and you're setting reservations on all of them, which I recommend you do, then it will make smarter decisions about where it goes based on other reservations you set across all those services. So if it knows that you've reserved, if there's 8 gig of memory in a system and you've set up a bunch of services, and on that particular node, you have that 8 gig and it's reserved the first 2 for the first container, the second 2 for the second container, it knows it only has 4 gig for reserving for other containers. But that technically has nothing to do with actuals of kernel memory. It's not doing in the background a top or some other memory command on the fly and constantly adjusting its real-world evaluations. That would be a more advanced thing. It's curious. I think actually Kubernetes does something like that and not a little more advanced. Swarm is a little more simpler in its reservation method, but I don't know that there's any way to in Docker native to limit that memory so that even the rest of the system can't use it. Now, quite frankly, here's my advice. If you're going to do containers on a host, you only do containers on that host. I would not be mixing containers on a production server now. This is not anything to do with your local machine for development or any of that. But if you're on a production server and you're running containers on a host, I recommend that that your Docker basically is one of the few things running on the system, on the pure host. Everything else is running in containers through Docker. And the reason there is that then you can set limits that make sense and you can control resource utilization, and you're hoping that your host doesn't use more than a half a gig of RAM on its own, right? Because if you just run Ubuntu, it's going to definitely use 300 or 400 megs just to run over time on a default standard Ubuntu server without a bunch of custom configurations. If you do that with Red Hat Enterprise Linux, my experience is with the 7 series is 500 to a gig are used without anything else running. So then I would set aside mentally, like there's a gig that I need to have extra in addition to my containers. But once you start mixing containers with host applications running, I think it gets more complicated to manage all of that stuff, because some things are controlled by Docker, some things are not, some things you can reserve memory. And to be clear, if you're a Linux guru, you can totally set up these memory limits and resource limits on the native applications themselves, because again, when we get into the foundations of Docker and how Docker exists, is Docker mostly is just using kernel features of the OS and packaging those up in nice command line formats, right? Because Docker didn't invent containers, they just made them really easy to use. So a lot of this stuff you could do on your own. You could, people are creating other kernel or container runtimes, other ways to run containers. Containers were around before Docker, something called LXC. We had containers in FreeBSD and Solaris a long time ago. We just didn't have this nice, easy to use tool that packaged up a whole lot of things like image management and volume management and pushing and pulling of images and all that kind of stuff along with those features. So if you were that advanced, I would say, and you're going to add all that stuff together in the same system, then you probably already know what you're doing and you can just do it, right? But for me and for most people that are simply deploying apps very quickly every day and we need to update those and control resources, just keep it all in Docker. Do the best you can to migrate everything one server at a time. And then if you have non-Docker stuff, run that on a separate server so that you can sort of keep your agile Docker infrastructure and your sort of the traditional bare metal or virtualization-based infrastructure separate. And I think it's way easier that way. So great question, though. Okay, next question on the list. Can we do it if we need a media data center container replicated across different nodes? A media data container replicated across different nodes. All right, so Alex, I think what you're talking about, I think, is really the question around data replication. So data replication is not a native feature of Docker. Docker doesn't solve every problem, unfortunately, in IT. So typically, when you're dealing with data, persistent data, right, you're going to need to think traditionally or in other tools for managing that data. Then what I mean by that is Docker doesn't magically make your data that you need to store for long periods of time. It doesn't solve that complete problem. If you need disk off server, like shared storage or iSCSI storage or fiber channel storage, if you need that kind of storage for persistent long-term use that will live when the container and the server dies, Docker has plugins to help connect you to that, but it's not going to provide that stuff for you. You're still going to need that third-party storage, right? If you're in AWS, you're probably going to use EBS or EFS. Those are some of their storage solutions that are off disk. They're off of the compute EC2 instance, right? Now, Docker provides volume plugins. Those help you connect to that storage, but it's not going to replace the need for that storage. So now in your question, you're asking about replication across many nodes. Now, there are plenty of tools out there that predate Docker for replicating data around nodes, right? There's rsync and there's Ceph. Those are open source tools in Linux. There's proprietary stuff like Portworks. We can look that up. And what's happening now is a lot of those tools are becoming Docker friendly or providing Docker plugins or Kubernetes plugins so that you can use those inside of Docker. So if we just go look up Portworks, this is a commercial tool that provides a free developer version for I think up to 3 nodes, and then you can scale it. So they do data replication and volume management and basically taking care of your data, whether you have off-server storage or you're doing, what do they call that? Something about zero storage. I used to know these things. Something about storage replication without having any additional storage. You can basically use the storage on your servers and replicate that around. So Portworks is a driver that works with Docker now that allows containers to have that persistent storage replicated around. There are other tools like this out there. I don't know all of them off the top of my head, but you can tend to Google around and figure out which ones are the best ones and what people are talking about and people are using. If anyone else has experience with any of these tools, feel free to throw them in chat to help Alex out. But in your case, for replicating around, you're going to need one of these tools to do that replication in addition to whatever container solution you decide to do, like Swarm or Kubernetes or just Docker native. Hope that helps. And if you try some tools out, let me know which ones you used or don't like or anything like that. Because there's new ones out all the time, and the old ones aren't necessarily the best ones anymore, and there's open source versus commercial. In my world, helping businesses, honestly, we tend to, in this case, like especially when it comes to data persistence and storage, which is one of the most important things of their infrastructure, we tend to lean towards commercial tools because we really, really are scared to lose data, right? So we tend to be a little more conservative about which open source tools we use, and just, does this work is not enough. That's not enough of a requirement. We need a tool that's validated, that has commercial support behind it. So tools like Portworks, or maybe even cloud native tools that are from a provider like AWS EFS, which provides multiple servers the ability to connect to the same storage over a network. That also is something I have definitely used that one. So good question. All right, you said bare metal a few seconds ago. does bare metal mean hardware plus OS or hardware plus hypervisor or hardware plus OS plus hypervisor on top of it? Okay, so in the world of IT, traditionally, great question, bare metal implies that it's hardware plus OS, that there's no virtualization layer there. And that is a trend. You know, we did virtualization migrations 15 years ago when everything back then was bare metal, and then we all went to virtualization. And now that pendulum has swung back a little bit because the reason we did virtualization back then was for increasing the use of our resources because servers were becoming increasingly more powerful, but our apps weren't requiring more and more resources necessarily, right? The same apps were running, but the servers were getting bigger and bigger. So we needed a way to splice up into isolated, discrete, secure areas so we could run apps on the same hardware. And so we did that with virtualization. That was one of the things that virtualization gave us. It's helped us save money. It helped us increase resource utilization. So if we were at my YouTube channel, there is actually a video where I talk just briefly a little bit about this. I'm actually going to go. So I actually have a video on my channel called How Docker is Changing IT. It's Why Docker, Why Now? I briefly go into some of the history and why that is, but the gist there is that we're now shifting a little bit back to the bare metal, which is the removing the virtualization layer, because containers in a lot of cases provides us that same level of abstraction and allows us to run many apps on the same server. Virtualization provides other benefits like the ability to run additional many kernels on the same bare metal host. So you might still need virtualization, but I think in the future we're going to have sort of a split where we're going to have, maybe 5-10 years from now, a lot of us will be running bare metal with containers, which don't have virtualization involved at all. So there's no VMware there or Hyper-V or anything like that. And then other things where we want different types of kernels. Maybe we want to run Windows and Linux. And so we're going to be doing we're going to have virtualization on those hosts, and that would not be bare metal. Technically, at the very bottom, they are still running on physical servers, but the industry term bare metal doesn't necessarily mean, it means not virtualization. So great question. Glad that I cleared that up. All right, I'm going to have some coffee. Next question. From Valdemir, maybe that's how you say your name. I hope I got that close. Hello. What is the right way to monitor your Docker swarm? How can I see if Docker restarted a container because of a failed health check? That's a great question. So let's talk about what Docker does out of the box, right? Docker provides health check features in Swarm. So out of the box, you get the ability to have a little bit of smarts in your containers and your Swarm services so that they will recreate containers when the containers fail their health check. But there's no way for you to visibly see that on a pretty chart or on a graph or get an email or a text alert. None of that is out of the box, right? Docker does not do what I will call long-term monitoring. It doesn't do metric storage. So it can't track 20 minutes of metrics and then give you a sense of the uptime and downtime and availability or performance or whatever. So for that, what I've started to do is in my Swarm Mastery course, the next module, the next section that's getting added is specifically to answer this question about metrics in Docker and metrics in Swarm and how do you monitor that. But there's several open source tools that have come out in the last few years. I would say, honestly, just about any popular modern-day monitoring tool is going to work with Docker. If you're using Swarm, it's best to get one that's Swarm API ready or Swarm API compatible. One of those is in my repo, and this is actually part of my DockerCon 2018 talk, where I give a brief example in this repo. So you can actually, I'm just going to pick this and put it into the chat. And in that example, that will show you something called a repo built by another member of the community called Swarm Prom, which takes Prometheus, and Prometheus is the monitoring tool. Oh, that's not it. That's the example. Prometheus IO. So Prometheus would be the main tool, but right now you're going to need a set of tools. There's a bunch of tools like that need to pull stuff out of your server and then get them into your swarm. They're going to pull that stuff out of your swarm and get it into Prometheus. And then there's, make it more correctly, it'll make it available to Prometheus because Prometheus is a pull model, not a push model. It goes and grabs metrics. Docker now has some of those built in. So I would say to start off with, to get a very quick example, watch my DockerCon 2018 talk. You can get that on brettfisher.com/docker. And if you go to brettfisher.com/docker, all of my courses, resources, repos, signing up for my newsletter, all that stuff is there in addition to my DockerCon 2018 talk right here. So that talk gives you a quick example of setting up a swarm and adding logging and monitoring to it. What I'm using there is Swarm Prom, which is this from Stefan, and he gives a great example of how to use Prometheus, the monitoring engine or GUI, along with a separate GUI on top of it called Grafana, along with some other tools that pulls out metrics like Node Exporter and CAdvisor. So it is a set of tools that you can use. Now, you could do none of that and say, I like Datadog, or I like New Relic, or I like sysdig, or something like that. These are all other tools in the ecosystem. If you simply type Docker monitoring, or Swarm monitoring, or Kubernetes monitoring, you're going to find all kinds of stuff out there. And all those tools will work. I tend to teach more open source tools because those are the ones that, well, first off, they're free, so it's easy for people to try them. And usually the paid for tools usually have their own great documentation and videos on how to use them, right? It's the open source tools that don't always have the best training and education around them. So I tend to teach those. But both will work. A lot of my clients use Datadog. A few use sysdig. A lot of them spin up their own stuff or just use the cloud tools that come with it. They use maybe AWS CloudWatch or DigitalOcean's tools, stuff like that. Great questions. So with the failed health check one, though, go definitely check out the Swarm Prom. As a summary, check out the Swarm Prom repo because that is a great way to start. It's a very, it takes all the open source tools, gives you a template to start from, and then you at least have a base to start with and in Swarm with health checks, and then you can grow from there. Fastest way, I think, to get started right now with health checks in Swarm. All right, next question from Aspen. All right, we use volumes from in Docker Compose v2, which isn't well supported in v3. We've been curious if v2 will be depreciated or if we will continue to be supported for non-Swarm users. Excellent question. I can't tell you what Docker is going to do officially because I just simply don't know. But from all the years of talking with the teams and the community around how Docker Compose works and the Compose file format, I can say that no, Compose version 2 I do not see being depreciated because version 2 and version 3 are forked a little bit. If you look at the history of version 2 and version 3, version 2 tends to be more focused around local Docker Compose feature sets, and that includes volumes from or not waiting on, but depends on, right? The depends underscore on, that is a v2 feature. Those are very useful for local Docker Compose. Those are also, though, usually very limited to a single node, which is what you're doing when you do local development. If you're using the Docker Compose command line, you're on your local machine, and you have a single machine, right? It's just your box. So a volumes from command cannot work in a multi-host scenario because the volume for that other container may be on a different host. And there's no way to get there, right? Docker doesn't provide that network-level volume connectivity, right? That's not a thing. So in v3, Docker decided this is going to be swarm-focused and cluster-focused versions of the Compose CLI. Not the CLI, the YAML format. So when you think of V3, think of Swarm. When you think of V2, think of Compose. Now, Compose locally and Swarm both still use V3 and V2 together, right? They still both run V2s and V3 files. But there are certain features in each one that are optimized for those different scenarios. So there's some V3 features that are going to only work in Swarm, like what's a good example? We can look one up. Let's just do that. Let's look up one. So if you're confused about all this, Docker Compose, the command line, is different than the file format. So if we look up Compose file format, we get this docs page that's just full of stuff. It's basically at docs.docker.com/compose/compose file, right? I live on this page. I am here all day long because there's so much stuff. There are things in here that are specific to local Docker Compose and then specific to servers, such as the build, right? The build stuff is only going to happen in the Docker Compose command line, docker-compose, that command line. Only this stuff will work there. And then there are things under, under deploy. The deploy feature sets for version 3 only are only going to work in Swarm. So I do not think that you need to worry about anything going away. It's simply a question of volumes from. Let's focus on that for a second. Volumes from will not work in a multi-server environment. So if you're ever going to go to production, you're eventually going to deal with something that's multi-server. Volumes from is not going to work for you. So to me, volumes from, the concept of that, of saying, I have a container and I'm going to have this other container and they're both going to share that volume, that is, to me, a legacy concept, not the file format or the setting itself, but to me, in a distributed world where my things are all over the place, that is a legacy concept because it assumes that my containers are on the same server, and they're likely not going to be in Swarm, right? I can set up Swarm to constrain them to there, but I really don't want to do that. I want these things to be able to run on server A or server B or server C. So I would say you may need to rethink the problem you're trying to solve. So if you need two containers to share data, then you probably need to create a volume, a named volume, and then have that named volume on shared storage, like AWS EFS or some other block storage that you can get to, or shared file storage or whatever. And then when I create those two services or those two containers, I give them the same name volume to go find. Okay, so you could do that in RexRay, for example. If you're using Swarm and you choose to do RexRay, which you can find at rexray.io, you can do that to provide connectivity to shared storage on the back end. And the one that I keep using as an example is AWS EFS. That's the Elastic File Services, I think is what it stands for in Amazon. That specific storage provides the feature to allow two different nodes to talk to the same location at the same time. That is a feature of the volume, of the storage itself, right? Because again, Docker does not provide that functionality. It can't suddenly make your storage magically work differently than what your storage is allowed to work. So you have to find storage that will allow multiple hosts to talk at the same time. So if you're in a case, and if you want to further go deeper into this answer, feel free to be more specific in the chat. I can get back to it in a few minutes. But I look at volumes from as if you're familiar with code smells, I think of ops smells, where it's a thing that suggests that I have to have, it's assuming I need a single server. And that's just, I can't assume that in most cases. Usually we're going to be 2 or 3 servers or more, even on the smallest infrastructure, because everybody wants to be fault tolerant. So I can't do that. But volumes from works great. If you're just using a command line tool locally, if you're just using this for local development, if it's just some sort of tool for playing around locally or doing things on your desktop, then volumes from works great. You can stick with V3 all day long. You won't even really need you can stick with V2 all day long. You won't need V3 if you're only using this for local development. Hopefully that makes sense. How check when deploy is finished successfully? Some tool or script. So how to check when a deploy is finished successfully, some tool or script. By the way, no Red Bull coffee today. I have coffee today, no Red Bull. Cheers. Dink. So what was the next question here? How to check when deploy is finished, some tools or scripts. So I'm assuming you're talking about a swarm deploy, and that is a little tricky, right? Because a swarm deploy command, a stack deploy is what we're talking about, Docker stack deploy in swarm, doesn't have, it does wait, but it doesn't necessarily wait for everything to be finished before returning to you. So what I would say is if you're needing a higher level tool to monitor the fact that those services are launched and available, then you're going to need some other. I don't have a script. Basically, everyone I've worked with on this, their solution is different. They would use a higher level tool like a Prometheus monitoring tool or a Datadog tool to track the service availability to make sure that the services don't go down in availability. Because really, after day one, right? Day one ops are when you first deploy the app for the very first time. You have no users, you just deployed the app. But everything after that, every future Docker stack deploy is a day two operation, which means it's an update. It's doing service updates. So presumably, you already have a bunch of other tools that are tracking whether your services are available and that your users can reach the services. Those are the tools that, to me, decide when whether a stack is successful or not. Because really, at the end of the day, the stack, to me, needs to track, any monitoring tool I'm going to use there needs to track, is my version updated across all my services? You know, because a service can do a rollback, right? A service can do an automatic rollback if it fails the update, and that may not be obvious. So you're definitely going to need other tools that track the services themselves, not so much the stack deployment. Because in the background, all a stack deployment's doing is a bunch of service updates, right? It's a command line abstraction that's hiding away a bunch of manual service update commands. So I would say that's a great tool. Maybe someone should create that. That's you run side by side, and it follows the stack file that it's looking at, and it follows those to make sure that everything deploys and doesn't do a rollback or doesn't do a health check fail. That would be a pretty neat tool. But I don't know of any right off the top of my head. If you know of one, please throw it in the chat. Otherwise, you have to use a bigger tool, like a monitoring tool, availability tools like that. Depreciated. Or deprecated. What are we talking about? I don't know what you're talking about. Sorry, did I say the wrong word? Yeah, I don't think it's going to be deprecated or depreciated, if that was the question. None of those things. The storage driver I played around with in the beginning seemed to be abandoned. This is Aspen. Oh, volume drivers. I'll take a look at RexRay. Yeah, so RexRay is a current project supported by VMware. They're maintaining it, the last I heard, which was at DockerCon 2 months ago. It was started by Dell, but Dell and VMware are the same company. Dell, EMC, VMware, they're all the same conglomerate of companies. So yeah, so that's the problem with storage, right? The trick around storage in general is that we have storage manufacturers, like Dell's solution and HP's solution and Amazon's solution, and then we have third-party software providers like Portworks that they provide a third-party commercial one. And so those are all interested parties in keeping their drivers up to date or keeping their solutions up to date. Then there are open source solutions that typically don't, they just help you connect to other stuff, right? And that's what RexRay does. RexRay doesn't provide you data replication magically. RexRay provides you the ability to use someone else's storage in Docker or someone else's storage in Swarm. That's really what RexRay does for you. And the cool thing about that is it really reduces RexRay's complexity. RexRay doesn't have to write a storage driver for replication because that's a really complicated thing that we're still trying to solve in the industry. So they're just there for connectivity and orchestration. All right, please make some video to understand about storage driver in Docker. How can I mount the volume with same permissions and user group in a container? Okay, so the first one is, I think, are you asking two questions? Niraj, I think is how you say your name. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Make some video to understand about storage drivers. So we understand that storage drivers and volume drivers are different. Storage drivers are about the underlying technology in Docker itself that stores your read-write layer and your images. That's storage drivers. 90% of the time, you don't have to mess with them. Then there's volume drivers, which are about your persistent data that's not in your images or your read-write layers of your containers. Volumes are separate from the container images. Storage drivers are a functionality of Docker that it comes out of the box with a set of storage drivers that are dependent upon your OS, your kernel features, and the software you have installed on that OS. You can do a Docker info, and in there we will see let's see where, up here under storage drivers, we'll see that on my system and on most systems by default in Linux, they're using Overlay 2 storage driver, which is the preferred storage driver from Docker by default. That doesn't necessarily have to do with the underlying file system, but it is related, right? Because in Linux, you know that we have multiple file system formats, just like in Windows. In Windows, we have NTFS and FAT32 and exFAT and stuff like that. In Linux, we have EXTFS, a whole bunch of other older file system formats that are still around, but EXTFS is sort of the default in a lot of systems nowadays. So your storage driver in Red Hat might be, what's it called? I can't remember the name of the storage driver. I'm running a blank. We can look that up. Device Manager, that's what it is. Red Hat Docker Storage Driver. So you'll usually show up with, here in the Docker Storage Driver section, great information about storage drivers. So if you haven't read this, read that first. It's a sort of dives into the underlying file system and then how storage drivers work on top of that. Years ago, we all had different drivers. We had Overlay 2, Overlay 1. We had AUFS. We had all sorts of other drivers, but the industry and Docker specifically have really focused around the Overlay 2. So for most users, I don't even talk about it anymore, because if they're running a Debian distribution or any modern distribution other than Red Hat, they're going to be using Overlay 2 by default, and it just works. It's almost always the best performing driver, and it's fine. If you're in the Red Hat world, you're going to be using Device Manager and something related to LVM. LVM is a partition manager, and you're going to be creating usually separate partitions on your disk. It gets more complicated with Red Hat just because they're more enterprisey, and they also have their own preferred driver that they build called Device Manager. So there you go. Other than telling people how to configure Device Manager, which there's already a bunch of great documentation out there, I don't have a lot to say about storage drivers because I feel like it's really a very advanced internals topic that most people don't. But if you have more questions on storage drivers, feel free. The most common question I get is, which one should I use? And I say Overlay 2, which is the default. If you're running a modern Docker version, it's going to use Overlay 2. If you're using Red Hat, you're going to be probably told by Red Hat to be supported, you have to use Device Manager. All right. And then how can I mount the volume with the same permission and user group inside a container? So this is a separate question about device mounts. So I'm gonna do 3 or 4 more questions, and then we're gonna have to wrap this up, unfortunately, at the end of our hour almost. But how do I mount a volume with the same permissions and user groups inside a container? So that's tricky. When you think about on Linux, basically users and groups in Linux are nothing but numbers. So we have friendly names for them, but the UID and the group ID or the GID, those are simply numbers, and it's not even that fancy, actually. I learned from a friend of mine, Phil Estes, who's one of the Docker maintainers and a Docker captain, that these numbers, all they need to do is match up. So there is no sort of special connection. If you have a host that has a volume, that on the host, you need the user ID to be 5,000 and the group ID to be 5,000. in your container and you need the user in the container to be that same user, all you would do, and there's plenty of examples out there on Google about how to do this, you just use the create user command in your container to create a user with that specific user ID and group ID during your Docker file, and then you change using the user command in your Docker file. If you just, if we look at under the builder, if we just look at the user command, I can tell it which user to run the container as. And so that way, that's going to be the user that's accessing the files in the volume. So as long as I have those matching up with the user or the group on the host, then you get that parity between, maybe you've got a backup tool somewhere else, or you've got some host process that needs to access those volumes. If that's what you're asking about, that's all you got to do. It gets way more complicated very quickly. If you're talking about multiple containers across multiple hosts needing to access shared storage that all have to have the same volumes and user IDs, that does get more complicated, but it really just comes down to user IDs and group IDs need to just be the same numbers, really. That's all that Linux is doing in the background. All right, few more questions. John says, correcting my pronunciation, pronunciation of the word depreciated with a K sound. Thank you for that. I need help. Oops, I lost my place in chat. Yeah, file with permission. Yeah, so I think I answered that hopefully for you. What does from scratch exactly mean? What are the underlying layers provided? Nothing. When you do a from scratch, which you cannot do in Windows because Windows requires a base layer, from scratch in Linux means 0 bytes, no files in the container, which means you have to add every single thing you want, including if you want a shell. If you want to have a shell in that container with an exec command, you have to add it manually. You'll find this with a lot of languages that provide static binaries. So if you, for example, are a Go language developer, you can see people making examples of creating a container from scratch and adding in the single Go binary they need that's statically built with all of its dependencies inside that file, and that's the only thing they need in the container. For most of us, we're not going to do that. We're going to create from Ubuntu or from Debian or from CentOS or something like that, or from PHP or from Apache, because we need all those things in there already, so we might as well just use the official OS, the official image provided from Docker. 777 and user and group Jenkins can be mounts within the container. Yeah, yes, 2 questions. Yeah, 777 relates to the permissions, which will pass through. The permissions will be the same, right, in the volume, in the container and outside the container. It's really the users and groups. So ignore the names, really. The names can be totally different. It's the IDs that have to match. But if it was me, I'd probably make the names and the IDs all the same just to keep everything easy inside and outside the container. What's your approach to admins that believe their job and responsibilities are being replaced with Docker Cloud? Great question, Sean. I have actually a post on that in my AMA, and it's kind of around. Well, there's several posts in here. If you look up labels, we have a couple on career, and one of them talks about ageism, or like me, I'm getting to be old, and is that an issue in IT? And I'm sure that it's an issue in every career, but I think that the nice thing about IT in general is that we are typically I feel like we're on the forefront of a lot of these things, like age doesn't matter, being remote doesn't matter. It tends to be more accepting of diverse communities. I believe and see all that, especially in the open source communities, very much. So I would say it's related to people believing that their job is being replaced. So I will tell you on a larger scale, right, all jobs are getting replaced by AI, right? Eventually, any job that we can do with the machine will get replaced. So the way to stay relevant, and the way that I've always stayed relevant in my career, is I'm always finding the latest tech and learning it, and it can be exhausting, right? So I have to dedicate a portion of my week to learning something new and staying ahead of the curve. If I'm in a job that doesn't do that, or doesn't support that, or doesn't encourage that, That's a problem for me, because if I get in a job where I'm only supporting 10-year-old technology, it's going to be really hard for me to find another job when that job goes away, because all jobs eventually change and go away or get replaced, or they shift to new, people. I was around when mainframes were popular, right? So mainframe workers, if they did not become PC admins, the mainframe people were eventually replaced, right? People that were only in to certain types of infrastructure and they didn't adapt to new infrastructure, like people that were only into bare metal hardware and didn't want to learn virtualization, got replaced by virtualization admins. And so it goes. So I don't believe that we're getting replaced. I think that it's a constant shift, right? Unlike other jobs where maybe if you're a truck driver, eventually there will be no truck drivers. Eventually there will be no taxi drivers. Eventually we won't have planes with humans in them driving them, flying them, right? But I believe the people that are running the technology and running the infrastructure have a choice. We're kind of lucky that way, that we're always going to need to be able to create software, manage software. Even if we're automating all of our deployments, someone has to still manage that automation and those deployments and all those tools. So even when we have robots building robots and robots, doing, we're still going to have people for at least my lifetime. Going to have people managing those processes and those tools. That's where I see sysadmin going. And throughout my career, I've always seen it just be admins constantly have to shift. When I started on PCs, it was Novell, right? We were using NetWare from the command line. Then it was Windows NT Server. Then it was Linux. And then it was VMware and virtualization. And then it was the cloud. And now it's containers. Like, all of these were major shifts, and all along that way, people that were not learning the new tools, even if it wasn't their job, if they weren't learning the new tools, eventually they got replaced. And so I look at it as it's the job of someone in IT to stay current and new, even if it's not their job currently, and to always be learning something. And if I'm in a job for too long that has me on way old technology, I usually try to find a different job, because that's only going to hurt my career and affect me personally, because eventually that company is going to not use that technology anymore, right? And then I won't be relevant to them anymore. So great question. I would love to talk more about that, but we're almost out of time. Restarting Windows is slow. Oh, I missed a question. I am currently learning Docker Swarm for my Pocket project. Should I look into Kubernetes? Yes, I recommend using Swarm first, because it's super easy to use. If you're doing small projects, personal projects, it's a great tool to get started. 80% of the stuff Swarm does is what Kubernetes does. Kubernetes is just more complicated and has a lot more options. So it can do things that Swarm can't do, and it has a huge ecosystem of tools that Swarm doesn't have. But Swarm's a great place to learn and get started. And then if you still want to learn more tools and you have that patience and that desire, go after Kubernetes, right? Learn it. And I'm, spoiler alert, working on a Kubernetes course with some friends of mine, and hopefully that'll be out either sometime this year. We don't know when. Hopefully that'll happen soon. And I'd say yes, absolutely. I would always recommend learning Swarm first, because I can teach Swarm in a day. I can teach Swarm to people that know Docker in half a day. I can't easily do that with Kubernetes. I tend to take twice as long with Kubernetes in teaching. So. Okay, two more questions. What's the best way to get my code in a container for a production image? Is it to build an image for every version of the code, or should we do a git pull in the Docker file? Siri's over there talking to me. I have a Siri speaker. Cancel.
I'm still on it.
Cancel. Stop talking. All right, Siri's having fun with me. All right, building.
It's taking a little too long here.
Building. We're talking about containers. Building containers and production images. CI/CD, right? If you starting out, everyone should be putting their code in containers with CI/CD. That includes using Docker Hub, right? Docker Hub out of the box provides the ability to look at GitHub or Bitbucket, and every time you code commit, build an image. That, to me, is what I would do. You don't have to do it on every branch. You can do it on maybe your master branch that's just for production, or maybe just a couple of branches. But if you have feature branches, you don't have to do it on those as well. It's really up to you. There's no harm in building every time unless you're paying for each build of of images. So I don't do that. I don't do that for every. I usually just do it for a few branches, and then locally on my machine, I might build on occasion separately from my CI/CD. I definitely don't recommend Git pulling inside of images. I think that that's an anti-pattern. I recommend always building the container images per commit or per branch or something like that. That is the standard way to do it in Docker. I think the Git pulls inside of images can be a bit of an anti-pattern when you're talking about code commits and getting that stuff. Because ideally, you want your images to be an artifact that you can uniquely pin to a commit. So usually teams will name their images the same way they name their branches and commits and feature releases. So maybe your images are date-based or commit ID based from your Git commits, or maybe they are versions if you manually push code to a specific branch. Maybe your master branch, you actually make releases and you tag them in Git or something. So that stuff is usually the same thing they do in images, because their images they want to be able to say, this image ID relates directly to this code in my repo. So, all right. For PHP app development, the current typical project deployment involves pulling code from Git or Bitbucket, then using the dependency manager composer to resolve upgrades or installations of libs. How should this be pieced together with Docker and Swarm so that an application server can be deployed instead as a usable state? So David, I have an example, and it's a bad example. I agree. I have not spent time to actually finish it all. I have an example on GitHub called PHP Good Defaults. It's similar to my Node project Good Defaults under my repos. PHP somewhere. There we go. It's a little bit of a work in progress, but it shows how to do a multi-image build for PHP, because PHP with Composer and all the other tools, people use NPM and other tools, Bower, Gulp, all that stuff with PHP. So it can get really complicated very fast, I find, for PHP developers. So what I typically see big shops doing when they have complex projects with PHP is they build a base image or an intermediate image is what we call it. So you have your base image, which is maybe the official PHP. Then you have an intermediate image that has all your standard libraries and tools for all of your projects, where you set versions, the specific version of Node I'm going to use and NPM I'm going to use and Composer and all that stuff. And that's here. And then you have your standard Docker file that would be per project. And your project Docker files would depend on your intermediate. And that way it shortens your build times, it reduces complexity in your project files. And then you have to worry a little bit about your compose files for local development. That gets also a little complicated, especially if you're doing microservices. That should be probably its own little course, right? Like a 3-hour course on just PHP development. Let me know in the comments, or if you would like that, specifically what you would look to get out of that, and I will consider that for a future course. Is my stomach growling? No, I am not hungry yet. All right, so I'm going to wrap this up. This has been a great hour. We've gone a little long today, but we had some great PHP questions at the end that I could not pass up, and some great image building questions there. So thanks so much. Remember, check me out, brettfisher.com. There's a newsletter there. I've got 2 courses. We got a 3rd course coming soon. We're already working on our 4th course, all related around Docker stuff. And we'll be back here around the same time next week. Look in the YouTube channel. If you subscribe, you'll get notifications of when this is going to be launched into a live Q&A. And you come back next week with your next questions. And we will talk soon. Thanks.